Let them eat cake. You've heard that expression. Maybe you know where it comes from, maybe you don't. But you've heard it, a shorthand for arrogance, for the kind of cruelty that doesn't know it's cruel. The phrase comes from a story about a queen, a French queen named Marie Antoinette. The story goes like this. France is starving, the peasants having no bread, and the queen, a woman who lives in the largest palace in the world, who wears diamonds whilst her country collapses, is told the people have nothing to eat. And she says with a wave of her hand, "Then let them eat cake." It's one of the most famous quotes in history. It's the thing most people know about her, if they know anything at all. But she never actually said it. The quote appears in a book written when Marie Antoinette was 9 years old, living in Vienna, speaking German. She had never set foot in France. The quote was pinned on her decades later, after she was already dead, by the people who needed the story to be true. And if the most famous thing anyone knows about this woman was never hers, then what else wasn't hers? What else was written about her that was never said, never did, never was? Before the guillotine, before the trial, before the revolution, there was a campaign. Hundreds of pamphlets printed in secret, sold in the dark, containing things so vile that most historians still won't quote them in full. They didn't describe the real Marie Antoinette. They built a character, a woman who never existed. And over 20 years, that character became more real than the woman, more famous than the woman. And then the revolution came. It was the character they convicted, but it was the real woman who bled. What happened to Marie Antoinette is one of the darkest stories I've told on this channel. Not because of how she died. It's everything that came before it. The parts they leave out. That will stay with you after this video ends. But before we continue, Late Mysteries exists for one reason, and that's to find the stories they buried. The ones too dark to be told during the day. They buried this one for a reason, and now we're going to dig it up. If that's what you're here for, hit the subscribe button and like this video, and I'll keep the candle lit. Now, let's meet the girl that was shipped across Europe to marry a stranger. Welcome to Late Mysteries. Before she was a queen. Before she was a villain. Before she was a symbol of everything wrong with the French monarchy, Marie Antoinette was a 15-year-old girl, standing on an island in the middle of the Rhine, having every piece of her identity removed by people she had never met. And the reason she was there will tell you everything about what was about to happen to her. She was born Maria Antonia Josefa Joanna on the 2nd of November, 1755, in the Hofburg Palace in Vienna. She was the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria and Emperor Francis I 15th. Not the heir, not the important one, not the child who would carry the dynasty. She was the spare, the insurance policy, the one you kept in reserve in case you needed to trade her for something useful. And that is exactly what happened. Austria and France had been enemies for 250 years. The Habsburgs and the Bourbons had fought each other across every field in Europe, bled each other white in wars that achieved nothing except the production of more wars. By the 1750s, the map had changed. Prussia was rising. Britain was rising. And Austria and France, looking at the new threat with the cold calculation that empires specialize in, decided that the enemy of their enemy was more valuable as a friend. They called it the diplomatic revolution. And the price of the revolution was a girl. Maria Theresa began preparing her youngest daughter for export, the way you'd prepare a product for market. French tutors were hired. Dance masters were brought in. The girl's teeth were corrected with early orthodontic work. Metal wire and pressure applied over months to straighten what nature had left crooked. Her hairline was reshaped. Her deportment was drilled until she could curtsy, walk, sit, and stand in the French manner without thinking. She was not being educated. She was being manufactured. Every lesson, every correction, every hour spent practicing the angle of her wrist during a formal greeting was an investment in a transaction. Austria needed France. France needed Austria. And the currency of the deal was a teenage girl who had no say in any of it. The marriage was negotiated over years. Contracts were drawn up. Territorial concessions were discussed. The dowry was set, 200,000 livres, paid in installments. And in April of 1770, when the girl was 14 years old, the deal was finalized. She would marry Louis Auguste, the Dauphin of France, the heir to the throne. A boy she had never met, never spoken to, never exchanged a single letter with. She knew what he looked like from a miniature portrait, the kind of small, idealized painting that ambassadors carried between courts. She knew he was shy. She knew he liked locks and hunting. She knew almost nothing. On the 21st of April, 1770, the proxy wedding took place in Vienna. Her brother stood in for the groom. The ceremony was performed, the papers were signed, and then the girl was put into a carriage and sent west, toward France, toward her husband, toward a future she had not chosen and could not refuse. The journey took weeks. A procession of 57 carriages, 340 horses, and an entourage so large it required its own supply chain. Entire towns turned out to watch it pass. She was the most expensive delivery in Europe. And then she reached the border. On an island in the middle of the Rhine, a small marshy spit of land between Kiel and Strasbourg, a pavilion had been built. It was a temporary structure, erected for this single purpose, and designed to serve as neutral territory, neither Austrian nor French. A nowhere place for a nowhere moment. The girl entered from the Austrian side. She was wearing Austrian clothes, Austrian jewelry. She was attended by Austrian ladies in waiting. She was carrying her Austrian dog, a small pug she'd had since childhood. Inside the pavilion, she was told to undress. Every piece of Austrian clothing was removed. Every ring, every pin, every thread that connected her to the country of her birth, to her mother's court, to the language she'd thought in, to the life she had lived for 14 years. Even the dog was taken from her. The rules were explicit. Nothing from her old life could cross to the French side. She was to arrive in France as a blank slate, a fresh product, uncontaminated by foreign manufacture. She was dressed in French clothes by French attendants she had never seen before. French silk, French shoes, French everything. And then she walked out the other side of the pavilion and into her new life. She was no longer Maria Antonia. She was Marie Antoinette. Even her name had been stripped and replaced. She arrived at Versailles on the 16th of May, 1770. The palace was the largest royal residence in the world. Over 700 rooms, 67 staircases, 2,000 windows reflecting the sun like a machine designed to produce the impression of divine power. 14,000 people lived and worked within its walls and grounds. It was not a home. It was a small city built around one idea, that the King of France was the center of the universe, and every person, every room, every garden, every fountain existed to reinforce the idea. She was 15. She spoke French with a German accent that the courtiers noticed immediately and would never let her forget. Her husband, the boy she had been manufactured to marry, met her with awkward formality. Louis Auguste was 16, overweight, painfully shy, and so uncomfortable in social situations that he could barely make eye contact. He liked metalwork. He liked taking locks apart and putting them back together. He did not, by any account, like people. The wedding night was observed, not directly. The king did not watch from a chair, but the ritual surrounding it left nothing to the imagination. The couple was formally put to bed by attendants. The bed was blessed by a bishop. The curtains were drawn, and the next morning the entire court knew what had happened, or rather what hadn't happened. The marriage was not consummated, not that night, not that week, not that month, not that year. And in Versailles, a palace built on surveillance, where every meal was a public performance, where the king's morning routine was a ceremony attended by dozens of courtiers who competed for the privilege of handing him his shirt. A secret like that didn't stay secret for long. Within months, the whispers had started. Within a year, they had reached Paris. Within 2 years, they had reached the courts of Europe. The Austrian girl and the French prince could not, or would not, produce an heir. And in a monarchy where the entire system of government depended on the continuity of the bloodline, that failure wasn't personal. It was political. It was existential. It was the kind of failure that could bring down a dynasty. For 7 years, the most watched couple in Europe slept in the same bed and failed to consummate their marriage. 7 years. 2,500 nights. And every single one of them was noted, discussed, analyzed, and weaponized by the people who stood to gain from the failure. Marie Antoinette wrote to her mother. The letters survive. They are the words of a young woman who is confused, embarrassed, isolated, and increasingly desperate. She doesn't understand what's wrong. She doesn't know how to fix it. She is living inside a glass box where the most intimate failure of her life is the most public fact about her. And she has no one to talk to about it. Her mother's replies are brutal. Maria Theresa did not send her daughter to France to be liked. She sent her to produce an heir. And the letters from Vienna make that priority savagely clear. The court turned. The court turned. The courtiers who had welcomed her as a novelty began to see her as a liability. The old guard, the established families who had been running Versailles for generations, resented this Austrian girl who had not yet earned her place. The faction loyal to Louis XV's mistress, Madame du Barry, despised her openly. Marie Antoinette was alone in the most crowded palace in Europe. She did what anyone would do. She looked for something that felt like freedom. She gambled. Card games. Deep into the night. Losing sums that the treasury noticed. She attended the Paris Opera. She went to masked balls, where for a few hours she could be someone without a title, without a country, without a marriage that wasn't working. She spent money on clothes, on jewelry, on the small extravagances that made the cage feel slightly less like a cage, and she built the Petit Trianon, a private retreat on the grounds of Versailles, a small chateau where the suffocating etiquette of court life did not apply, where she could dress simply, where she could walk in a garden, where she could, for a few hours at a time, stop being the Dauphine of France and be something closer to a person. Paris watched all of it. And Paris did not see a lonely girl trying to survive an impossible situation. Paris saw a foreign woman spending French money while failing to do the one thing she was brought here to do. The pamphlets started before the marriage was consummated, before the revolution, before any of it, and they started with the one thing that was guaranteed to cause the most damage. They started with sex. Specifically, they started with the accusation that Marie Antoinette was sleeping with everyone at Versailles except her husband. Women, men, her husband's brother, the Comte d'Artois, the Duchesse de Polignac, her closest friend, cardinals, guardsmen, anyone and everyone, in graphic, illustrated, pornographic detail, distributed on the streets of Paris about a woman whose actual, private, humiliating reality was that she could not get her husband to sleep with her at all. The lie was the exact inversion of the truth, and that is what made it so devastating. Because the cruelest propaganda doesn't invent from nothing. It takes the wound you're already hiding and tears it open in public. Marie Antoinette's wound was the marriage bed. The pamphlets didn't just expose the wound, they replaced it with fiction. It was the precise opposite of her pain. And then they made the fiction louder than the truth. 7 years. And then, finally, in 1777, it ended. Louis underwent a medical procedure, or found the courage, or received the guidance, depending on which historian you trust. And the marriage was consummated. Marie Antoinette wrote to her mother with a relief that leaps off the page even 250 years later. Between 1778 and 1786, she gave birth to 4 children: Marie Thérèse, Louis Joseph, Louis Charles, Sophie. She was, by every private account, a devoted mother. She nursed her children in an era when royal women handed their infants to wet nurses as a matter of course. She played with them. She grieved when Sophie died at 11 months. She watched Louis Joseph weaken from tuberculosis and could do nothing to stop it. But none of that reached Paris. Paris had the pamphlets. Paris had the character. And the character was already more real than the woman, because by now, the pamphlets had multiplied. They had evolved. They had moved beyond sex into politics. And the thing they built, the monster they constructed from ink and paper, and the public's willingness to believe the worst, was about to collide with something that no amount of propaganda had prepared anyone for. A revolution. Before the guillotine. Before the mob. Before the revolution itself. There was a weapon. Hundreds of anonymous pamphlets, printed in secret, sold in the dark. They didn't describe Marie Antoinette. They invented her. And the woman they invented was so convincing that an entire nation went to war with a person who didn't exist. They were called libels, little books. Some were a few pages long. Some were entire volumes. They were printed on cheap paper, sold under tavern tables, passed from hand to hand in the markets and workshops of Paris. They were anonymous. The authors hid behind pseudonyms, or no names at all, because the content they produced could get you imprisoned or worse. The libels were not unique to Marie Antoinette. They were a genre. For decades, underground publishers in France had produced scandalous pamphlets targeting the monarchy, the church, the aristocracy, anyone in power. They were the tabloid press, the gossip column, and the political cartoon of their era, rolled into one and sold without any of the legal constraints that governed the legitimate press. But the libels aimed at Marie Antoinette were different. They were more sustained, more coordinated, more vicious, and more effective than anything that had come before. Over the course of roughly 20 years, from the mid-1770s to the Revolution, hundreds of pamphlets were produced that focused specifically and relentlessly on the Queen. And they followed a pattern, a deliberate escalating pattern that built the fictional Marie Antoinette, piece by piece, the way an architect builds a structure, foundation first, then walls, then the roof. The foundation was sex. The earliest libels were pornographic. They depicted the Queen in explicit scenarios with every category of partner the authors could imagine: male courtiers, female friends, clergymen, servants, foreign diplomats. Illustrations were crude, deliberately degrading, and designed to humiliate. The text was worse. It attributed to her a sexual appetite so monstrous, so insatiable, that it became a kind of dark comedy, except the people reading it weren't laughing. They were absorbing it. They were filing it away as fact. Then came the walls. Once the sexual character was established, once the readers had internalized the image of a woman governed entirely by appetite, pamphlets added politics. Madame Deficit. That was the name they gave her, the woman who was draining the treasury to fund her pleasures, the woman who spent French gold on Austrian interests, the woman who gambled away the nation's wealth at card tables while children went hungry in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine. Some of this had a grain of truth, distorted beyond recognition. Marie Antoinette did spend extravagantly, though her spending was a fraction of the court's total expenditure, and a rounding error compared to the cost of France's involvement in the American Revolution, which had nearly bankrupted the country. But the libels didn't deal in proportion. They dealt in archetype, and the archetype they were building was simple and devastatingly effective. The foreign woman who devours the nation. Foreign. That word did more work than any other. Marie Antoinette was Austrian. In France, that made her an outsider in the most fundamental sense. A woman whose loyalties could never be fully trusted, whose first allegiance was always suspected to be elsewhere. The libels exploited this relentlessly. L'Autrichienne, the Austrian woman. But the word carried a second meaning, a pun that Parisians would have caught immediately. Autrichienne also sounds like other bitch. The insult was baked into the name. Every time someone called her the Austrian woman, they were also calling her something else. And then, the roof. The affair of the diamond necklace. 1785. The single event that fused the fictional Marie Antoinette to the real one so completely that no force on earth could separate them again. The facts are these. A con artist named Jeanne de la Motte, a woman of minor noble birth who had spent years scheming her way into the fringes of court society, devised an extraordinary fraud. She convinced Cardinal de Rohan, a senior clergyman who desperately wanted to regain the Queen's favor, that Marie Antoinette secretly wished to purchase an enormously expensive diamond necklace, but could not be seen to buy it herself. Jeanne forged letters in the Queen's handwriting. She arranged a nighttime meeting in the gardens of Versailles between the cardinal and a prostitute who had been dressed to resemble the Queen. The cardinal, believing he was acting on royal instructions, arranged the purchase of the necklace on credit. Jeanne took the necklace, broke it apart, and sold the diamonds. When the jewelers demanded payment and the fraud unraveled, it became the scandal of the decade. The cardinal was arrested, Jeanne was arrested, and a trial was held. A public trial in the Parlement of Paris that became the most sensational legal proceeding in French history. Marie Antoinette had nothing to do with any of it. She had been offered the necklace years earlier and had refused it, one of the few acts of financial restraint in her public record. She was, by every factual measure, the victim of the fraud. It didn't matter. The cardinal was acquitted. The public concluded that the court had protected him because revealing the full truth would have embarrassed the Queen. The libels seized on the affair and ran with it. In the pamphlet version of events, Marie Antoinette was not the victim of the fraud. She was its architect. She had wanted the necklace. She had schemed to get it, and when she was caught, she'd used her power to blame an innocent woman and a naive churchman. The diamond necklace affair was the moment the fictional Marie Antoinette became unfalsifiable. The archetype was complete. The foreign woman, the sexual deviant, the reckless spender, the political schemer. Once that architecture existed in the public mind, every subsequent piece of information, true or false, was interpreted through it. She donates to charity? Guilt money. Trying to buy back a reputation she destroyed. She wears a simple muslin dress instead of court finery. She's mocking the peasants, playing at being poor, the way rich people play at being humble. She builds a model farm at the Petit Trianon. She's pretending to be a shepherdess, while real shepherdesses can't afford bread. Every action, no matter how innocent, was fed into the machine and came out the other side as evidence. This is the mechanism that should keep you up at night, not because it's historical, but because it's current. The libelles invented a woman who never existed, distributed her image to millions, and made her so real that the actual woman became invisible. The character replaced the person, and once that replacement was complete, nothing the real person did or said could reach the public, because the public was no longer looking at her. They were looking at the character, and the character confirmed everything they already believed. Every online pylon, every viral misquote, every time a real human being is reduced to a character in a story that strangers are telling about them, a story the person didn't write, can't edit, and can't escape. That's the libelles. The technology has changed. The speed has changed. The mechanism is identical. Build the character. Distribute the character. Let the character become more real than the person, and then hold the person accountable for the character's crimes. By 1789, when the revolution began, the real Marie Antoinette was almost beside the point. The woman the mob hated was a fiction, but it was the real woman, the one who had spent 7 years trying to consummate a marriage, who had buried a daughter, who had watched her son waste away from disease, who had written desperate letters to a mother who responded with criticism instead of comfort. It was that woman who heard the crowd outside the gates of Versailles on the night of October the 5th. And what happened that night? What the crowd did when they breached the palace? What they did to the guards? What they carried on pikes through the streets as the royal family was dragged to Paris is the part the textbooks rushed past. But we're not going to rush past it. The revolution arrived at Versailles on a Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, Marie Antoinette's bodyguards were dead. Their heads were on pikes, and the Queen of France was being marched to Paris in a carriage surrounded by a crowd carrying the severed parts of the men who had tried to protect her. This is the part the history books summarize in a sentence, but we're not going to summarize it. By the autumn of 1789, Paris was starving. The harvest had failed. The price of bread, the staple of the French diet, the single item that determined whether a working family ate or didn't, had risen to levels that put it beyond the reach of ordinary people. A laborer might spend 80% of his wages on bread alone, and when the bread ran out, there was nothing to replace it. No social safety net, no government relief program, no system designed to prevent the poorest people in the richest kingdom in Europe from watching their children go hungry. On the 5th of October, a crowd gathered in the central markets of Paris. It began with women market women, working women, women who had spent the morning discovering that the bread stalls were empty again. Their anger was not ideological. It was visceral. Their children were hungry, and the people responsible for feeding them. The king, the court, the system were 12 miles away in a palace with 14,000 servants. The crowd grew. It became a march. Thousands of women joined by men, joined by members of the National Guard, joined by anyone who had a grievance and a pair of shoes, began walking west along the road from Paris to Versailles, 12 miles, in the rain, carrying pikes, kitchen knives, muskets, and the kind of fury that only comes from watching power ignore suffering for so long that the suffering becomes indistinguishable from the power itself. They arrived at Versailles in the late afternoon. Palace gates were still open. The crowd surged into the courtyard. Demands were shouted: bread, grain, relief. A delegation was admitted to see the king. Louis, bewildered and indecisive, agreed to sanction the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which he had been resisting for weeks. He promised bread. The crowd didn't leave. They set up camp in the courtyards and gardens of Versailles. Thousands of people, soaked, angry, pressed against the walls of the largest palace in Europe, waiting for morning. What happened next occurred in the pre-dawn hours of October the 6th. The exact sequence is disputed by historians, but the outcome is not. A group from the crowd found an unguarded entrance. They entered the palace. They made their way through the corridors toward the queen's apartments. The bodyguards stationed outside her door, members of the garde du corps, the royal household guard, tried to stop them. They were overwhelmed. 2 guards were killed. In some accounts, their bodies were mutilated. Their heads were severed. The heads were placed on pikes and paraded through the corridors of the palace and then out into the courtyard, where the crowd received them with cheers. Marie Antoinette was woken by the sound of the mob at her door. She fled, barefoot, in her nightgown, clutching whatever she could grab through a concealed passage that connected her apartments to the king's. She reached Louis's chambers minutes, possibly seconds, before the crowd reached hers. They had come for her specifically, not for Louis, not for the Dauphin, for her. The libelles had done their work. The fictional Marie Antoinette, the monster, the foreign parasite, the woman who said, "Let them eat cake," was the target. The crowd had been told for 20 years that this woman was the source of their suffering, and now they were in her bedroom and she was gone, and the only things they found were her empty bed and the blood of the men who had died trying to protect her. The royal family was brought to a balcony. The crowd demanded to see the queen. Marie Antoinette stepped out, alone. Without Louis, without the children. She stood before a crowd of thousands who had just murdered her guards and put their heads on pikes. The muskets in the crowd were pointed at her. She curtsied. The accounts differ on what happened in the crowd at that moment. Some describe a stunned silence. Some describe individual voices shouting for her death. Some describe a shift, a brief, fragile moment where the sight of the actual woman, standing alone on a balcony above a sea of rage, produced something that the pamphlets couldn't account for. A recognition, perhaps, that she was real, that she was small, that she was standing there. A voice from the crowd called out, "To Paris!" The cry was taken up. It spread. It became a chant, then a demand, then an inevitability. The king agreed. He had no choice. The royal family was loaded into a carriage. The procession began, the 12-mile journey from Versailles to Paris, from the palace the Bourbons had occupied for a century, to the Tuileries Palace in the center of a city that wanted them dead. The severed heads of the murdered guards were carried on pikes at the front of the procession. The crowd marched alongside the carriage. They chanted. They sang. Some of the women carried loaves of bread on the points of their bayonets, a grim, triumphant display of the thing they had come for. Marie Antoinette sat in the carriage with her children on her lap. Her son was 4 years old. Her daughter was 11. They rode for 6 hours through a crowd that had killed for them and would kill again. When they arrived in Paris, they were installed in the Tuileries, a palace that had been largely unused for decades. It was dusty, poorly maintained, and surrounded on all sides by a city that now functioned as both their home and their prison. For the next 2 years, the royal family lived under effective house arrest. They were watched constantly. Their movements were restricted. Their correspondence was monitored. Marie Antoinette spent her days with her children, reading, sewing, trying to maintain the routines of a normal life inside a cage that was slowly shrinking. And then they tried to run. The flight to Vienna, June 1791. A plan hatched in secret, executed with catastrophic incompetence. The royal family disguised themselves, Marie Antoinette as a Russian baroness, Louis as her valet, and slipped out of the Tuileries at midnight. They made it 200 miles in a heavy, conspicuous carriage that traveled at half the speed of a courier on horseback. They were recognized at Saint-Ménehould. A local postmaster named Jean-Baptiste Duray compared the king's face to the image on a coin and raised the alarm. At Vienna, 20 miles from the border, they were stopped, surrounded, and dragged back to Paris in a journey that took 4 days under armed escort through towns where the crowds lined the roads in hostile silence. Whatever ambiguity had remained about the royal family's status, were they prisoners or constitutional monarchs, captives or participants, evaporated at Vienna. They had tried to flee. They had tried to abandon France, and in the logic of the revolution, abandonment was treason. The months that followed were a slow-motion collapse. The monarchy was officially abolished in September 1792. Louis was tried for treason in December, convicted in January, and executed on the 21st of January, 1793. He was 48 years old. Marie Antoinette, watching from a window in the Temple prison, heard the cannon that signaled his death. She was moved to the conciergerie, the prison known as the antechamber of death, because almost no one who entered it left alive. Her cell was damp, cold, and watched around the clock by guards who were under orders to never leave her alone. She was 37 years old. Her hair had turned white. She was thin, exhausted, and bleeding. Most historians believe she was suffering from uterine hemorrhaging, possibly caused by cervical or uterine cancer. She was dying before they killed her. But the revolution wasn't satisfied with her death. They needed something else first. They needed her complete destruction. They needed to sever the last thread of sympathy that might still connect the public to the woman in the cell. So they took her children, and then they did something with her son that remains, to this day, one of the most disturbing acts in the history of the French Revolution. Something that even the people who orchestrated it couldn't fully stomach when they saw it play out in a courtroom. They took her 8-year-old son from her cell. They gave him to a man whose job was to make the boy forget he was ever royal. And then, at the trial, they brought him back. And what they made that child say about his own mother in open court in front of hundreds of people is the thing that haunts me most about this entire story. Louis Charles was 8 years old when they separated him from his mother. He had been living with Marie Antoinette in the Temple prison, a medieval fortress in the Marais district of Paris that had been converted into the royal family's jail. The conditions were harsh, but survivable. The family was together. Marie Antoinette spent her days with her children, maintaining as much normalcy as she could inside a stone cell. She taught them. She read to them. She held them. On the 3rd of July, 1793, guards came for the boy. They told Marie Antoinette that her son was being moved to another part of the tower. She understood what this meant. She held him. She refused to let go. The standoff lasted over an hour. Officials threatened her. She begged. She screamed. She clung to her child with the kind of desperate animal grip that has no concern for dignity or protocol or the men with bayonets standing in the doorway. They took him. Louis Charles was placed in the custody of a man named Antoine Simon. Simon was a cobbler. He was also a committed revolutionary, a member of the Paris Commune who had been specifically selected for this task. His job was re-education. He was to take the boy who had been raised as a prince and turn him into a citizen, to strip away every trace of royalty, the language, the manners, the identity, the way the Austrian clothes had been stripped from his mother on the island in the Rhine 23 years earlier. The methods were not gentle. Simon gave the boy alcohol. He taught him revolutionary songs. He forced him to wear the red cap of liberty. He struck him. He paraded him in front of visitors as proof of the revolution's success. Look, the little prince is one of us now. He made the child curse his parents. He made him denounce his own blood. The boy was 8. And then, in October 1793, when the time came to put Marie Antoinette on trial, they brought the child forward and they used him. The trial began on the 14th of October in the Revolutionary Tribunal. Marie Antoinette had been in the conciergerie for over 2 months. She was sick, pale, and so thin that the white dress she wore hung from her frame. Her hair, the hair that had once been styled in elaborate towers that set the fashion for all of Europe, was white and cut short. She was 37, and she looked 60. The charges were read: treason, conspiring with foreign powers against France, depleting the national treasury, maintaining secret intelligence with the enemies of the Republic. Some of the charges had substance. Marie Antoinette had indeed corresponded with Austrian officials, had indeed encouraged foreign intervention. She was not innocent of politics. But the prosecution needed more than politics. They needed something that would destroy any remaining sympathy for the woman in the dock. Something so monstrous that it would transform her from a political prisoner into something less than human. They brought out Louis Charles. The boy, now 9, thin, unwell, clearly frightened, was presented before the tribunal, and a statement was read, a statement the boy had signed. I am not going to repeat the specific accusation here because it involved a child, and some things do not deserve to be repeated, but I will tell you this. The charge described a crime against the boy himself, a crime that the prosecution claimed his own mother had committed against him. The most intimate, the most unforgivable category of crime that can be committed against a child. And they put those words in the mouth of a 9-year-old and made him say them in open court about the woman who had held him in a prison cell and refused to let go. The courtroom went silent. The boy had been coached. Whether through violence, through manipulation, through the sustained destruction of a child who had been separated from everyone he loved and placed in the hands of a man who used cruelty as a teaching method, the statement was not the boy's. Everyone in that courtroom knew it. The prosecution knew it. The judges knew it. The audience knew it. But it was on paper, and the boy was there. and the boy was there. And the accusation was now part of the record. Marie Antoinette had sat through hours of charges without breaking. Treason, conspiracy, death. She had answered with dignity, with precision, with the kind of calm that comes from understanding that the verdict is already decided and the only thing left to control is how you face it. But this stopped her. She did not answer the prosecution. She did not address the judges. She turned to the public gallery, to the rows of ordinary Parisians who had come to watch, to the women in the upper galleries, to the mothers. And she said, "If I have not replied, it is because nature itself refuses to answer such a charge laid against a mother. I appeal to all mothers present in this court. Is such a crime possible?" The gallery reacted. The women, the tricodiuses, the knitting women who sat through every trial and every execution with revolutionary fervor, who had cheered at the deaths of aristocrats and priests, were shaken. Something crossed the room that the prosecution had not anticipated. A murmur, a shift, the sound of an accusation that had gone too far, that had overshot its mark, that had reached beyond politics into something that even the revolution's most committed supporters could not stomach. One of the jurors reportedly said afterward that this moment nearly saved her, that the prosecution, in reaching for the most extreme weapon available, had accidentally revealed the machinery behind the trial. The desperation, the fabrication, the willingness to use a child as a weapon against his own mother. For one moment, the real woman was visible through the propaganda, the mother, not the monster. It didn't matter. The verdict was guilty on all counts. The sentence was death. It was delivered at 4 in the morning on the 16th of October, 1793, after a trial that had lasted less than 2 days. She was given a few hours. She wrote a letter, her last, to her sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth. The letter was never delivered. It was intercepted and filed away. It wasn't found for decades. In it, she wrote about her children, about her faith, about forgiveness. She asked that her son be told, when he was old enough to understand, not to avenge his parents' deaths. The boy never received the message. Louis Charles remained in the Temple prison after his mother's death. Simon was eventually dismissed. The boy was left alone in a dark cell, largely unattended, for months. He fell ill. His joints swelled. He stopped speaking. He died on the 8th of June, 1795. He was 10 years old. His sister, Marie Therese, survived. She was eventually released in a prisoner exchange and spent the rest of her life in exile. She was the only member of the immediate family to make it out alive. This is how the story ends. Not with the quote she never said, not with the character they built from ink and lies. It ends with a woman in a white dress in an open car, hands tied behind her back, riding through a city that hated someone who wasn't her. And the last words she actually spoke will stay with you longer than the ones they invented. At 11 o'clock in the morning, on the 6th of October, 1793, Marie Antoinette was taken from the conciergerie. Louis had been given a closed carriage for his execution, a final dignity, a box between himself and the crowd. Marie Antoinette was given a cart, an open tumbril, a wooden farm cart of the kind used to transport prisoners to the guillotine. Exposed on all sides, visible from every angle, with nothing between the condemned and the crowd except air. The choice was deliberate. Louis had been a king. Marie Antoinette was a criminal. The distinction was made in the vehicle. Her hands were tied behind her back. Her hair, white and shorn, was covered by a plain cap. She wore a white dress. White, in the iconography of the Revolution, was not innocence. It was the color assigned to condemned prisoners. She was a message written in fabric. The white dress said, "This woman is already dead. You are watching a formality." The artist, Jacques-Louis David, the Revolution's official painter, the man who would later paint Napoleon's coronation, was in the crowd that day. He sketched her as the cart passed. The drawing survives. It shows a woman sitting upright, chin raised, lips pressed together, eyes focused on nothing. Her hands are bound, her posture is rigid. David, who despised the monarchy and had voted for the king's execution, drew her with something that might be contempt, or might be something else. The sketch is fast, rough, almost violent in its strokes, but he drew her face in detail. He could not look away from her face. The route from the Conciergerie to the Place de la Révolution, the modern Place de la Concorde, was long. The cart moved slowly through streets lined with spectators, thousands of people. Some shouted insults. Some watched in silence. Some turned away. A few, very few, and at great personal risk, are reported to have wept. The journey took over an hour. An hour in an open cart, hands tied, moving through a city that had spent 20 years learning to hate a woman who had been replaced, long ago, by a character in a pamphlet. She arrived at the scaffold. She climbed the steps, and at the top, in the moment between arriving at the platform and kneeling at the blade, she stepped on the executioner's foot. His name was Charles, Henri Sanson. He was the hereditary executioner of Paris, a position that passed from father to son, a family trade like carpentry or blacksmithing, except the product was death. Sanson had executed Louis 9 months earlier. He would execute thousands of people during the Terror. He was, by this point, a professional in every sense of the word. Marie Antoinette stepped on his foot. It was an accident. She was climbing a wooden staircase with her hands tied behind her back, unable to balance properly, wearing shoes that were too thin for the rough planks, and she said, "Pardonnez-moi, monsieur, je ne l'ai pas fait exprès." Exprès. Pardon me, sir. I did not mean to do it. Those were her last words. Not defiance, not a political statement, not the theatrical bravery that the revolution's victims sometimes summoned at the scaffold. An apology. A small, instinctive, reflexive act of courtesy directed at the man who was about to cut off her head. The manners that had been drilled into her since childhood, the deportment, the etiquette, the automatic politeness that had been manufactured into her on the island in the Rhine when she was 14 years old, surfaced one final time. In the last moment of her life, she was still the girl who had been taught to apologize. The blade fell at 12:15 in the afternoon. The executioner held up the head. The crowd cheered, or some of them cheered. The accounts vary. Some say the cheering was thunderous. Others say it was thinner than expected. Others say there was a silence underneath the noise. A silence that the noise was trying to cover. She was 37 years old. She had been Queen of France for 19 years. She had been a prisoner for 3. She had been a character in someone else's story for her entire adult life. Her body was thrown into an unmarked grave in the Madeleine Cemetery, along with the bodies of the other victims of the guillotine. No marker, no name, no ceremony. She was buried in quicklime to speed decomposition. The revolution wanted her erased the same way the French had erased her Austrian identity on the island in the Rhine, completely, chemically, without a trace. In 1815, during the Bourbon Restoration, her remains were exhumed and reburied in the Basilica of Saint-Denis, alongside the other French kings and queens. Louis XVI ordered the recovery. A memorial was erected. Prayers were said, 22 years too late, over bones that the quicklime had not quite managed to dissolve. But here is the thing that survives longer than the bones, the quote, "Let them eat cake." 230 years after her death, it is still attributed to her. It is in school textbooks. It is on merchandise. It is the first thing, and often the only thing, that most people in the world know about Marie Antoinette. She never said it. It was written about a woman who may never have existed, by a man who never attributed it to her, and pinned on her by a culture that needed her to have said it, because the story only works if the villain is a villain. The quote is a libel. It is the libel. It is the last pamphlet, and it is still in circulation. The pamphlets built a woman who was cruel, who was indifferent, who was monstrous. The revolution killed the real woman and left the character standing. And the character made of ink and rage and the bottomless human appetite for a story that confirms what we already believe, outlived everything. It outlived the revolution. It outlived Napoleon. It outlived 2 world wars, the invention of the internet, and every attempt by every historian to correct the record. Because corrections don't travel as fast as stories. The truth is always more complicated than the lie. And complicated doesn't fit on a pamphlet. Complicated doesn't fit in a chant. Complicated doesn't fit on a postcard in the gift shop at Versailles that says, "Let them eat cake," in cursive script with a picture of a woman who never said it. They invented a woman. They convicted the invention. They executed the person. And then they let the invention live forever. Think about that the next time you see a headline that reduces a human being to a single quote. The next time you watch a person become a character in a story they didn't write. The next time you feel the satisfying certainty that someone you've never met deserves what's coming to them because the story you've been told is so clear, so simple, so perfectly designed to make you angry. Ask yourself, who wrote the pamphlet? Because someone always does. And the person who pays for it is never the one who wrote it. That's Marie Antoinette, the real one. The one that's been buried under a fake quote and a cartoon villain for 230 years. A girl stripped of her identity on an island at 14. A wife trapped in a marriage while the entire continent is watching. A mother whose son was taken from her cell and used as a weapon against her in court. A woman who apologized to her executioner for stepping on his foot. And a character built in pamphlets from lies, from the kind of fiction that's more satisfying than the truth. That character replaced her. That character outlived her. That character is still more famous than she is. Let them eat cake. She never said it, but we still believe it because the story is simpler than the truth. And we have always preferred the story. If this changed the way you see Marie Antoinette, subscribe to Late Mysteries, where we illuminate the dark corners of history, the stories that live beneath the ones we tell ourselves. Until next time, keep the candle lit.